Hello, Maggie. A huge welcome to the show.
Hello, Lian. It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Oh, I feel like we've already kind of like traveled halfway around the world and got to know each other a bit already. And I'm already kind of thinking you're going to be a more than a one guest episode. So let's see.
Well,
I feel like we've got so much to talk about.
I am one of those annoying people you don't want to ask around for a dinner party because I've got far too many experiences.
Well, let's begin with hearing a bit about what I already know is quite an interesting life that's led you to do the work you're doing now.
Well, I think the first thing that happened when I was about 9 or 10, I went to church with my family because you did. I didn't particularly believe anything. You just showed up at Christmas. You showed up on Sunday. You got bored. You picked your nose in the pews, that kind of thing. And then one day we were saying the Magnificat, which is supposed to be Mary saying, "My soul shall magnify the Lord." And I was standing there just ignoring it. And then suddenly this kind of color came in. It was color so strong I could taste it, and it had a scent to it and a sound and a glory, and these words just exploded in my head saying, "You will do this." And I just didn't know what it meant, but it was this really extraordinary moment when I felt picked up and taken right into the sacred. And I didn't tell anybody about it for decades, literally, because I knew it was inexplicable and I'd be accused of being horribly arrogant. But something happened at that moment. And I've always had to hold on to that, if you see what I mean. But it was a wonderful foundation to hold on to later. Later on, the armchair Christianity was shattered when my first husband died. We were married for just 1 year and 16 days, and he died horribly in my arms. And the hospice chaplain had told me the day before that he couldn't go to heaven because he wasn't a Christian, and literally walked out of the room. This is more than 30 years ago. It doesn't happen like that anymore. But at the time, that was utterly horrific. And it just made me go, what? No, no, no. Everything that I'd sort of pseudo believed all my life was just being thrown in my face. No, this is not a loving God. This is not a trustworthy God. This is not a God that I can hold on to. This is nothing that I can believe in or understand or conceive of. And I asked at my husband's funeral, back then you could have a humanist funeral or a Christian one. And that was basically the two options. And the family weren't on for a humanist one. And frankly, at that point, neither was I. And I said to the vicar, please don't say I'm the resurrection and the life, because I'll hear him damned to hell again. And he said, I'm sorry, my dear, that's the way the ceremony is. And so I walked up the aisle after my young husband's coffin, hearing him damned to hell. And I still cry.
Oh.
All those years later, even though it is healed, but the wound is important to know because it's part of the wounded healer aspect. And I basically said, this isn't right. And I threw myself into the New Age to get away from this Christianity and learned so much, got into chakras and Buddhists and healing and Tantra and all sorts of things. But I became to realize after a few years that unless I dealt with this separating fear and hatred I got about Christianity, I would never heal. So it was about actually going back and finding out how I get into the root of that. That's why I'm ordained. That's why I wear my rainbow clerical collar, because I'm on the edge of the box, but on the inside now. My work is with those who are just saying, I cannot believe in this God. I cannot believe this God is benevolent. I have to find a different way. And I think actually we have to go back to healing that root injury.
Oh my goodness. I had no idea this was the conversation we were going to have, but I'm feeling so much gratitude that we are. This is exactly the conversation that's here for us to have. And I think not just you and I, and not just us and our listeners, but actually as a world right now. Certainly in the people that I'm in deep conversation with that are really the wounded healers too. It's interesting that when you mentioned that, I had just full body chills because the next podcast I'm planning to do on my own next week is literally on the wounded healer. Is something I've been really delving deep into at the moment, and seeing that really all of us that are here to be healers, whether we call ourselves healers or not, as I was talking to you before, you know, whether we call ourselves a therapist, a coach, a teacher, you know, anyone that is in this work of helping people to reclaim themselves, to move towards wholeness, we are healers. And really, to fully be healers, we have to recognize that we're also wounded healers. The medicine's found in the wound.
Yes.
And so I love the way that you are in full, not just acceptance of that, but like really honoring that, like not trying to like dismiss, like the wound, like the whole point of the wounded healer, like Chiron, it was never fully healed. The wound is still there, kind
The
of like
scar is there.
present.
The scar is there.
The scar is there. And that leads us, I think, again, really beautifully to what we were talking about before we started recording, which is the part that I think is so important for those of us that are the wounded healers is our relationship with the divine. They come together. They don't make sense without that conscious relationship with the divine.
I agree. And I think it's also really important to accept our own evolution and our growth in the process, because I've come across quite a few life coaches who mean so well, but they've only got information. They're still too young in themselves. And that's perfectly natural and normal, and they will have a clientele who will absolutely need them. But as time goes on, you have to start working with the experience that you have, because information on its own does not give you knowledge or wisdom, but experience does. And the most powerful thing you can say to so many people is, I have been there.
Yes.
I have been there. And I'm surviving, I'm thriving, I'm doing really well. And if there's anything that I've learned that can be assistance to you, please let me help. If my experience is not of assistance to you, then bless you, move on, and please find somebody whose experience is. But the role of the elder, and thank God people are coming to me nowadays sometimes and seeing me as an elder, is just to sit there with people and say, let's guide you through this on your path. And what is your experience of divinity? Where is your wound with God? Does the word God even hurt you? Do you have to call it spirit? Do you have to call it the light? Because if you do have to call it that, you don't trust this divinity to be benevolent towards you. So how can we work with that? How can we get you into a better relationship with the Holy One?
Well, you've opened up this really beautiful illumination as to some of the ways this wound shows up, and those examples you gave. I've had conversations like that over and over again, where people have this you can actually see like this visceral reaction to the word God. And actually there was a point where I think I didn't have a religious upbringing at all, so I don't think I had the same wounding that many do. It was more like a second hand sort of, almost like, yeah, what's going on for them over there doesn't look great, I think I'll steer clear. It was a little bit like that, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
But what you're talking about here, again, I think one way or another we are brought present to the wounding we have in our relationship with God. And the only way forward is to meet that. So please
have to take the sword out that went in the first place. You can't just put salves all the way around that sword is. You have to take the hilt of it and go, I'm pulling this out and I'm going to see what comes out with it.
Yes. And what would you say, like your story in particular, the sword was so obvious, like what you described in terms of that experience with your first husband, is such and again, often is the case, you know, the fact that this is what you're here to do work, the sword was so obvious.
Yes.
How do you see
I
that?
was lucky because I can be quite dim about that kind of thing.
How have you seen that shows up for others, or what's the equivalent sword that you've seen often is the case that shows up for other people?
Well, most often in the modern world, it's for, I work on the comedy circuit, and a lot of my colleagues and friends are on the autistic spectrum. I'm slightly on that spectrum.
I'm
And a lot of
autistic
them are
too.
gay or transgender. Yes, just a little bit. Gay and transgender people and their relationship with the Holy One. And this clerical shirt allegedly saved somebody's life at the Edinburgh Festival, because I was walking along the street and I saw a transgender woman in a silver dress and said, "Oh, look at you, what a great dress, you look fabulous." And she looked at me and was shocked, because I was clearly a vicar. And we started talking, and I was telling her how lovely she was and how brave she was. And I can't remember most of the conversation, but a year later she contacted me and said she'd planned to take her own life that day because she felt totally unlovable. And she changed her mind because of that conversation. She's now a successful comedian. She still has mental health issues, but she's helping other comedians and other transgender people as well. And you just sort of think, oh my God, just by buying this and wearing it help change somebody's life so they could start talking about God, because she felt totally rejected by clerical people and by religion. And of course you can absolutely understand that, because the rejection has been profound over the years. And one of the reasons why I love to study Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, nothing to do with the Kabbalah Center, it's a much older tradition, is because it teaches that every great spiritual tradition must update for the age. And if it doesn't update, it's become a graven image and set in stone. And it's not only irrelevant, it's dangerous. So I think it's incredibly important to say, I'm an edge priest. I work on the edge of the tradition. I've got 1 foot in and I've got 1 foot out. I've got a foot in shamanism. I've got about 6 feet, actually. But it's just so important to say, God knows that we humans have evolved. For goodness sake, there are 613 laws in the Hebrew Testament. Most of them now don't apply because God knows we've invented the fridge. You have to update these things. They were very relevant then, but now let's look and let's get in communication with this spiritual entity which we call God, and start saying God the transcendent is in relationship with God the immanent in us. And I love a lot of Catholicism, even though I know it's done a lot of harm in the world because of the images. And Teresa of Avila, Christ has no body now but yours, no hands or feet but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he watches the world today. Yours is the body with which he takes action. How clear is that?
Yeah. I'm remembering just before we started this show, you sharing that, I may have this slightly wrong, but you were sharing that as a Franciscan, with that comes this understanding there's no original sin. And what I'm hearing in what you were just sharing is, and this is certainly my own, not just belief, really my experience, that when we're really talking about God, it doesn't exclude anyone.
No.
God
does not make mistakes.
Yes, there is no exclusion. Exclusion wouldn't even logically make sense, let alone be how it actually is. And
no,
so
absolutely. And a lot of my work has been going into the Hebrew and the Greek of the Bible and looking at how the translations are actually really very inaccurate on many things. And simple aspects such as saying that Jesus said nothing against homosexuality. There was no word for homosexuality back then. It was only invented in the 1940s, apparently. But what he did talk about were eunuchs, and eunuchs in those days simply meant somebody who could not reproduce naturally. And that would include homosexuality or transgender issues, or people who'd had their bollocks knocked off because they were working in a harem. It didn't matter. And Jesus said quite clearly, some people are born eunuchs, some people are made eunuchs, and some people become eunuchs. And he was totally accepting of that. And as far as I'm concerned, that covers the whole overarching aspect of what people would call homosexuality or lesbianism or transgender. So as far as I'm concerned, Jesus was okay with all aspects of that part of the spectrum of life. That's, for me, that's seminal.
Yes, I love that so much. And so coming to other forms of wounds around God, one of the ones I've certainly noticed, and again, because I haven't had a religious upbringing myself, this wasn't something I experienced, but certainly with our students who have, but then somehow or other, you know, not dissimilar to the experience you had, but perhaps not quite as like one obvious moment, but have experienced things that just felt desperately unfair, you know, very traumatic childhoods, for example, where there was this sense of, well, if there is a God, he's abandoned me, he's punishing me.
Yes.
That isn't a God who loves me if he's let me suffer like this.
Yes.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, that is the big question, and I'm really glad you asked it. And I'm not sure I can give you a very good answer, but I'll do my best. It does come back to this idea of original sin, which is a 4th century construct from St. Augustine. It didn't exist before then. No Jew has any concept of it. Therefore, neither would of Jesus. That's the first thing to understand. Original sin, my mother taught me when I had my first period that this was the curse of Eve. It's about shame.
Goodness.
It's about shame. Now, Jewish folk have lots of guilt, but they don't carry shame the way that Christians do, because guilt is about something I did wrong. Shame is about something I am is wrong. And once you've got some of that, you can't actually get into a good relationship with the Holy One because you think you're already condemned. And it's something that there were 2 factions back in the Middle Ages, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The Franciscans said, no, God loves everybody. It's clear in the Old Testament and the New Testament that every action by humanity is forgiven. It's also clear that Eve was tricked and that she did not know that anything she was doing was wrong. And if there's anything going on there that God is pointing out to us, it's the fact that both Adam and Eve blamed other people for their own decisions. So the whole idea is about taking responsibility for your life. Yes, I did this. Was it wrong? I didn't know, in which case I'm sorry. End of matter, God forgives. And if you've got that teaching behind you, you can actually start to work out this issue about, well, maybe God doesn't hate me. But you have to start going back to that original sword that went in. And I actually say to people, this is what it actually says in the Bible. It doesn't say that. And people, I was doing this talk on original sin in Tennessee just 2 weeks ago. Small congregation, fair enough. I don't mind, the right people turn up. And one woman just sat there and wept.
Oh,
she just wept to know that God didn't hate her because she was a woman. And you think how deep this has gone. And even though nowadays it isn't taught the way it was taught when I was growing up, because I was in a church-going family, it's still in the culture. It's in the British culture. It's certainly all over the American culture at the moment, because the whole abortion issue is about shame. You are wrong. You are wicked. You are evil, for doing this. And abortion's a far more complex issue than that anyway, but it's always about whether or not we allow humanity to step out of this shame and say, I am worthy and I am special and I am beloved by God. And that's the whole heart of my work. And really, every workshop I do is around guiding people to say, where did it go wrong for you? How early did it go wrong for you that you did not know that there were arms encircling you in love? And I think we've also been taught that Jesus came. This is the whole idea of penal substitutionary atonement. St. Anselm going on to Calvin and Luther, which is that humanity is so evil that God had to send his own son and murder his own son to reclaim us. And even that didn't really work because we're still so evil. And it's just it's wicked. The teaching is actually wicked. And what I read and what I see and what I've interpreted is it's nothing like that at all. The idea of Christ, Jesus, is a personification in one lifetime of the Christ consciousness, which has existed since all time. And the Christ consciousness is the love of God, the compassion of God. So the idea of Jesus coming down is not to save us from our sins, it's to show us how we can step up and take responsibility and be the being of love. That will, if we can be the being of love, then God reflects that back to us, because God will be to us whatever we believe God is. The ultimate name of God is I am that I am. So if I think God is wicked and evil and cruel and heartless, by the law of attraction, I'll start creating that. But if I can learn to just trust for one instant that God might not be that mean, by law of attraction, I will start drawing the grace to me that is already there. We have free will, and we dictate a large amount of our lives. Not all. We haven't got ultimate free will. I can never be a Formula One driver or a Royal Ballet star now. I can't. So I don't have that, but yes. I have other doorways that have been opened, you know?
Yes.
So you have to work with what passageways are open to you. And it's just an absolute honor and a privilege to sit with people and say, well, where did this knife go in? How can we show you that it was wrongly placed and that there is no justification for it? And if the people were then, so it does often happen that somebody goes, I didn't know. I believe this, I was taught this, and it's not true. I can start letting it go now. And the relief, Lian, is palpable.
That makes so much sense. And I think certainly for those of us that haven't had a kind of very strong religious background, and I guess particularly perhaps there's a contrast also, you know, you've just been in America and it's there that these themes are much stronger than perhaps they are here in Britain. But I think it's useful to recognize that in some ways they can be more insidious, like more damaging is not quite the right word, but I'm going to use that, because they're so pushed into the our unconscious. We're not actually even aware of how these beliefs are affecting us, because they've been handed down for generations. They're kind of in the culture. They're in the way that people, for example, will perceive women and treat women, even if they're not aware that that's going on.
Yes.
And so I think these things are so important to make conscious.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. And also the way that religion has been perceived the last 20, 30 years, from whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's right-wing Christianity, whether it's Zionism, people will say, well, if that's what God's like, I don't want anything to do with it, and turn their backs before they've even investigated. I mean, the blessing that happened to me, this hospice chaplain, and he was an angel, you know, because he woke me up. It hurt like hell, but it woke me up. And that's, for a start, my interpretation of purgatory or hell, which is, people talk about these eternal fires. The fires are eternal, but you don't stay in them for eternity. You pass through them to have the irrelevant and hurtful thoughts sort of blasted out. So that guy came along with the fires of hell and blasted me to wake me up. And I had a choice. I could stay there and hate, or I could start to heal. And I decided I had a choice. I went mad or I went crazy. So I went crazy. And I'm a trained journalist, BBC World Service journalist back in the day. And so I started investigating. I went to university to study New Testament Greek because I wanted to know what Jesus actually had said, instead of relying on somebody else's translation. And then I discovered there's 32,000 versions of the New Testament in Greek. So that wasn't going to help that much, but only about 5,000 of them are significantly different, and only about 50 of them are drastically different. But even so, that still matters. So I just went down and dirty into it, you know. And I also said, because I threw Jesus out of the window, but God just wouldn't go in some form, though I was calling it the light. And eventually I did. I went down on my knees and said, you've got to help me. Because I'm still lost here, and I'm still feeling this hatred. And this hatred, I know about the law of attraction. This is not helping me. This is making me broke. so much of the work in the New Age is people who are terribly, terribly broke because they're still carrying this shadow of anger and hatred and wound. And basically the Holy One said, okay, you serious about that? And introduced me to a Jewish man who was at the far end of his tether from Judaism, just as I was with Christianity. And over 8 years, we reeled each other back in through Jewish mysticism. And then when we'd done that job, God just said, right, marriage over. And God did say that, and it was not humanity that broke up the marriage, even though he left me for another woman. It was God, because we were going through difficult times. And I literally put up on Silent Unity, which is an amazing website, unity.org/prayer. They will pray 24/7 for 30 days with affirmative prayer for you. So I went to them and said, my marriage is not comfortable at the moment. I place it under divine order. I give it back to you, God. Do with it as you will. And 2 days later, he left.
Wow.
So I couldn't even be pissed off, which was most annoying. I was pissed off, obviously. But we had a role with each other to draw us back to God in our own traditions. And in retrospect, you can see that it was marvelous and wonderful. And I did have an issue with one of Jesus's teachings, which said that those whom God has brought together, let no human put asunder, which of course is in the Christian wedding service. But if God brings you together, once the relationship's done, God can put you asunder. And that's helped a lot of people with shame too, because God can and will. The definition of adultery is not sexual infidelity. It's adding poison to something. And sometimes staying together in a relationship that's become poisonous is far more adulterous than having an affair.
I think that's such a helpful revealing. So coming to the way that we name God, because I think this in itself is such an interesting clue, really, as to where wounding can be. And so it's not to say that, and I don't imagine you're saying this either, but certainly from my perspective, there is nothing in me that thinks like we should call God. We can absolutely use whatever words make sense to us. And if we're interested in becoming whole, if we're interested in really opening to the love of God, understanding those places that we have got closure is really helpful. And certainly looking at the ways that we do have this reaction, this kind of rigidity around like, oh, I couldn't possibly use this word. I mean, so for example, because much of my path has been in shamanic work, typically the word used is spirit. And so if I'm talking with people who are kind of in that world, or I'm talking about shamanic kind of work, often I'll use the word spirit, but I won't always use that word. And so it's recognizing kind of like, is there just a functional reason we're using a particular word, or is it this like rigidity, this closure, like, oh, the word God brings with it a connotation that in itself is revealing a wound. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. You're good at this, aren't you?
Thank you. I've been doing it a while.
Well, there's two aspects to that. Firstly, if you have got an issue with the word God, that issue does need to be looked at. But it's absolutely fair to change the name if you want to. However, if you go into the research into what the Bible says, if you are of the Judeo-Christian or Islamic tradition, it's really good to go to the Old Testament, because there are 10 names for God there, half of which are feminine. And in fact, the first two words of the Bible are Bereshit Elohim. In the beginning, the Elohim created. And the Elohim is a feminine plural. The masculine God, the one we regard as masculine anyway, though it has no gender, it's a verb, so it has no gender, is the tetragrammaton, which is Yod He Vav He, pronounced Yahweh. That's usually talked of as being masculine and called Lord in the Old Testament, whereas Elohim is always God in the Old Testament. And the Elohist texts are the oldest one, and they were written down at the time of the first temple, which honored divine masculine and feminine. So I find it very useful to say to people, to start with, God is the first they, them, because the creator of the universe is feminine plural. The creator of humanity is Yahweh Elohim, which is Elohim giving birth to her child Yahweh, which is the source point of humanity. And then beyond that, we have we've got gods of judgment, the God of compassion, all sorts of aspects in the Testament. So you can actually pick a name if you want to. But to me, using spirit can be a cop-out. I'm not saying for a minute it is for you. But I do know that sometimes when I work with people who are working with spirit, they're not necessarily working with the highest level of spirit. Because spirit can be good or bad. And there's no doubt about it also that God can be ferocious and fierce, but God is always ultimately on the point of healing you. It's always the healing fires of grace. There's always a come-through point, but there is also a dark night of the soul. So it is absolutely valid to say that if you're going to go right down and dirty and deep into the relationship with God, at times it's going to hurt. Because have you ever read the Narnia books?
Yes.
Do you remember Eustace in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader was turned into a dragon because he was having dragonish thoughts of greed? And when Aslan comes along, Aslan, of course, is the Christ figure, comes along and takes that away, he has to sort of use his claw to cut through that skin of the dragonish skin to let the real Eustace out. And Eustace says, it hurts, it's brief, but it hurts. And the representation of that I get is that sometimes it hurts to let go of your old beliefs because they're safe. And you're also in your own society around those beliefs. And a lot of people in spiritual work, and I would include myself in that too, I'm still a work in progress, still hold a lot of rage and a lot of anger. And they don't want to let go of that because that anger and rage makes you right. And as long as you're right, you can feel quite secure in a funny kind of way. And that takes you straight back to the Garden of Eden, because the whole idea of the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is that when you think you know what's good and evil, you're right.
Yes.
And we're still eating from that all the time. And I think the most important thing, I do a podcast with a fellow Edge priest called Mark Townsend, who was sort of kicked out of the Church of England, then reinstated and then left. And we call ourselves train wrecks for Jesus. And he's exactly the same as me, as sort of saying, we're all so broken. But that's how the light gets in. That was originally from Rumi, but it's a Leonard Cohen song, that the cracks are where the light gets in. And if you're not cracked, then you won't allow that light to come in or out. But the cracking hurts. It hurts. Life hurts. Jesus was crucified on a cross to say God was willing to show us that God, masculine, feminine, whatever, knows what this pain is like and will show us the way through. And there's such a clear teaching in the Gospel of Luke. There's 3 people on the crosses there. There's 2, we call them thieves, the words malefactors, we don't know what they did. But the first one, who is going round and round on the karmic wheel. You can see on the Greek Orthodox cross, there's an angle like that on the bottom strut, showing the wheel of karma going round. The first one says, if you're the Son of God, get us off here. It's basically saying, I want you to save me. And that's kindergarten religion. I want you, God, to save me. Look at me. I want you to save me. And the second one goes, no, leave him alone. We knew what we were doing. We knew what the cost was of doing what we did. We knew what society gave the punishment out, and we still went ahead and did it. Leave him alone. We knew what we were doing. And Jesus turns to the second one and says, today you'll be with me in paradise. How clear is that?
Oh, I love that so much.
It's okay. I am partially responsible for my life. Now, I had cancer a few years ago. Was it my fault I had cancer? No. Was it my life choices that contributed to the cancer? Yes, unconscious life choices, not my thought, part of my loading, part of my upbringing, part of my teaching, part of my wounding, part of my astrology, if you like. All came together to give me a nasty cancer, which was going to come here and teach me things that I did not want to learn, but was going to have to learn if I was going to get through it. Am I grateful for that now? Absolutely. Did it hurt like hell? Oh, God, yes. Oh, God, it hurt. But I came through it, and I know so many other people who come through it one way or the other, even if it's going to die in peace or to come through in more peace. But it's understanding that you have to let go of so much that you want to hold on believing. My husband died from chemotherapy. He didn't die from his cancer. He had at least a year to live, and he was given a form of chemotherapy which destroyed his stomach. He basically vomited his stomach up.
Oh, goodness.
And died horribly. So I, of course, hated chemotherapy, absolutely hated it, went into spiritual work, vowed that I would never have it. And then I got a cancer, and I worked with it as much as I could, but I couldn't do the work in time. So I had a choice. I really did. I had a choice to give up my prejudice and have some chemo to buy me more time. They were clear it couldn't cure me, but it could buy me more time. Or go down spitting, I won't have it. So I had to say, I have to break my vow to me in order to learn to live and to be more compassionate with myself and the world. And they actually offered me the exact chemo that killed Henry. Now, what a clear message was that? And I said, I can't possibly. And they said, oh, well, we've worked on that. It doesn't kill people anymore because we found out. Oh, thanks a bunch. But I didn't have that actual chemo. But I realized that I was really prejudiced. And there are cases where chemo buys people time. There are cases when chemo turns people's lives around. And there are cases when people cures you. I don't like it, and I don't think it's the answer, but I can never again stand on my high horse and say, it's evil. See how important that was?
Wow, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. It's yes, an incredible illumination. And this brings me to something I've seen showing up a lot just recently. And it's the way that using the word synchronicity, which as I'm sure you know, is a Jungian term, and it's kind of like become a bit, let's say, reductive and sort of simplified in kind of like modern times, where it's just like anything nice and magical that happens we call synchronicity, when really it's about that kind of like our outer world mirroring in some way kind of like what's happening internally in a way that's not down to cause and effect. And so it very much can be seen as like showing us like this is really happening, like we really are, like what's occurring internally, what we're being shown of our soul is true. It's being mirrored back by the external world. And then what I've been seeing recently is how we're really keen to claim that when it's something nice, you know, when it's like the synchronicity, something like, oh, wow, that symbol matches the thing that I've been seeing about myself. Where we don't want to do that is where it's something that we see as negative or painful. Then it's just like, that's not synchronicity. That's just like bad luck. It's unfair. It's awful. Why is this happening to me? And just recently, I've seen over and over again these ways that this kind of like, in quote marks, negative synchronicity can sometimes be the most powerful form of mirroring back kind of like where we are and what we're being called to. And that example you've just given, like, wow, like if you were to have missed the synchronicity in that, again, the way that this was something that was actually for your, it was medicine for you, ironically, like the most poisonous form of medicine, but you recognizing that allowed it to be the healing.
Yes. It was, I can't tell you, it wasn't difficult. I had to have a friend come with me and hold my hand because I was so frightened. But it was actually about trusting the friend and trusting the people. And also what was lovely was being ordained, and I'm ordained in the Independent Catholic Church. So we use holy water and that kind of thing. And I took holy water with me, and I said to the nurses, may I bless this drug before we start with holy water? And they said, yes, absolutely. And then a couple of them later, when I came back, said, do you have any more of that holy water? The lady over there might need it. You know, and they didn't say that to the lady because she probably wasn't Christian, but they took it and poured it on the drug, you know, on the capsule containing the drug, you know. So you never know how just having the guts to sort of stand up and maybe do something in a negative situation may help. But you're so right about this negativity in America. I don't know if you've heard about the happiness set point. We all
Yes, I think I have. Yes, where we
yeah, a
kind of, no matter
happiness
what
set
happens,
point.
we kind of end up back at the
Yeah,
same
we tend,
place.
tend to
Yeah.
end up back at it.
Mm.
Well, I was really thrilled to go off on this lecture tour in America. It was a real step up for me, and I was really honored to do it. But it was slightly above my happiness set point. So I managed to get ill while I was out there.
Mm.
And I managed to feel weak and feeble. And there came a point where I wasn't really able to turn myself around very well and I needed external help. So I went to my dear friend Deb Rowley in New Zealand. She's a friend from Facebook, and we've become very close. She helped me hugely during the cancer, and I hardly recommend her as a healing, and said, "Hey, Deb, I can't pick up from here. I've got to a point where I can't pick up, and I know I'm starting to draw difficult stuff. Can you help?" And she came back and she just basically said, "Whoa, where were you on Saturday or Sunday?" And I said, "I was teaching at a church in Tennessee." And she said, "What happened to there? What happened there?" And I said, "There was shooting in 2008. She said, "You got 2 of the dead people with you, honey. No wonder you feel sick. Let's work."
Oh.
And sometimes it's external, sometimes it's internal, but sometimes you're shining a light and you're going to catch some hitchhikers. So you have to learn how to do the work of sending them over the rainbow bridge. And if anybody's interested in that, I have a meditation which I can send, which always works, and anybody can use it to help people get across the bridge. I don't like the term rainbow bridge, but it's the common one at the moment. And basically, I don't know, Lian, if this was complete wanky bollocks, to be honest. I don't know if I picked up 2 dead people who've been shot. I really don't know. I'm not that psychic, but I do know that if somebody gives me the hint, I will do the work, even if it's not true. And it's actually about doing that work of cleansing and healing always, and asking for help if you know you can't get up there, because you will, especially if you're working for the good, if you can, you will set up a bit of a target. It's true that on the one hand, you mustn't set your light under a bushel. You mustn't keep it from people. But it's also true that if you shine a bright light on a dark night, you attract a lot of pests.
Yes.
So you've got to be very fervent about defending yourself, protecting yourself, looking after yourself. And once you feel yourself on that slippery slope, difficult things are starting to happen. Get help from somebody who's detached from that, who can scan you, look you through and go, honey, you picked something up here. Because again, you assume it's your fault, and it probably isn't your fault. You probably went out shining, and some discarnate soul who just missed the light for no particular reason and has been hanging around looking for some light comes along and goes, "Can you help? Can you help?" and attaches to you. There's usually no side to it or anything. It's not meant to be nasty. They're just asking for help.
Yes, there's something beautiful in that, isn't there? The way that it's like, really, that's, no matter what the state is, everyone's looking for the same thing. They're looking for help, and then it's about us opening to help. And I guess bringing it back to where we began this, our relationship with God, it seems to me that when we are kind of looking for help, when we're recognizing, okay, this is where I'm blocked, this is where I'm wounded, this is where I've got rigidity, this is where I feel ill, whatever the thing is, more and more, whilst in this instance it was you reaching out to your friend for help, I think there is that sort of deeper sense of, ultimately, you're reaching out to God. It comes in so many forms, but it's just knowing that that's what we have. The help is there, the love is there.
Yes.
We're not meant to do this on our own.
Yes. I mean, what was happening to me was, well, you're shamanistic, so you understand it. I was doing my morning prayers and I was doing my evening prayers, and I was walking, making sure I was walking with my totem animal all the time. And I did a short meditation, and I just got an image that he was wounded. And I thought, okay, I can't handle this on my own. I need somebody. I need a priest. And Deb isn't a priest, but for me, she's a priest. We're case counselors in spiritual work. And so sometimes you can do it yourself. Sometimes you just can't do it yourself. And the image I got of the totem animal being wounded was enough to say, okay, I've got a slash here. So I can't get my energy up to what I conceive God to be.
Yes.
So I need some help along these lines.
Beautiful. We are up on time. has flown by. This has been absolutely gorgeous conversation, and a real experience too. I think when we're talking about topics of this kind, God, for me, it's so much about, are we available to feel what we're talking about? You know, there's some really interesting, you know, because of your breadth of experience, like lots of very interesting like historical references and different things that are kind of like coming from a much more sort of intellectual place. But ultimately, it's like, are they bringing us back to feeling what's here for us? And certainly for me, that's been the case. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
Well, there's the podcast, Trainwrecks for Jesus. It's on Spotify and Podbean. I've also got an old podcast, which hopefully I'll be able to revitalize with my very dear friend and witch, Susie Crockford. It's called Wise Women, the Vicar and the Witch. And that's also on Podbean and Spotify. And that's great because we go hammer and tongs about shamanism and Christianity and really, stretch it out. And Mark and I also stretch it out and go into the text. So two podcasts. I've got two websites, maggywhitehouse.com, which is sort of the respectable one with ministry and comedy. And I've got
not the train wreck one.
And treeofsapphires.com, which is all about Kabbalah, which is this Jewish mysticism. I do keep them separate. They're linked to each other, but usually people booking a comedian or an after dinner speaker don't really want a rabid Kabbalist. You know? no, it's too scary for them. And obviously I'm on Facebook. I'm not on X anymore, but I'm around. And if you need me, you'll find me. But if you're interested in the Chapel of Liberation meditation, just email me at Maggy, MAWGY, at maggywhitehouse.com, and I will very gladly send it to you. And it's a wonderful thing to use at times right now, the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. If you know of anybody who's died, you can do this particular meditation that just makes sure that they weren't shocked out of going through. Everybody goes through. Everybody goes through. But you can take your time about it because you may be afraid of going through. You may feel safer staying behind. You may not know that you're dead. That often happens. But I'm very, very happy to share it. It's for absolutely everybody. And I know it works because I've had messages back from people saying that they've got very clear messages that somebody has moved through and is now at peace.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for that gift. Thank you so much, Maggy. It's such a pleasure. Really, really enjoyed our conversation.
Pleasure talking to you. It really, really was.
Thank you.